Hi, everyone. I'm Ron Larson, and thanks so much for joining me for my presentation on the Leif Erikson Movement and the involvement of McFarland resident Iver M. Kalnes. It is widely accepted that Leif Erikson was the first European to set foot on the North American continent in the area of what is today Newfoundland, nearly 500 years before Christopher Columbus arrived in the New World. In the late 19th century, many Norwegian Americans felt that Leif Erikson was not getting the recognition that he deserved for his many accomplishments. Their efforts over many decades, beginning in the 1870s, to honor Leif Erikson and to make known to the general public his explorations is what I call the Leif Erikson Movement. Some would say the culmination of the movement took place in Wisconsin. On October 9, 1929, the state celebrated the first annual Leif Erikson Special Observance Day, making it the first statewide observance day in the country, an event whose seeds were planted over 50 years earlier. I will be looking at how Leif Erikson Day came to become a special observance day in Wisconsin. I will outline the various events leading up to 1929, when Leif Erikson Day became law. And I will also spend some time talking about my grandfather, Iver M. Kalnes, his role in the Leif Erikson movement, and a bit about his life and career. To start with, let's take a look at the early days of the Leif Erikson movement. Not surprisingly, the origins of the movement began with Rasmus Bjorn Andersen, the preeminent Norwegian American from the 1870s until his death in 1936. It also includes the famous Norwegian violinist Ole Bull. In 1873, Bull was living in Madison and spent a great deal of time with Andersen. During their time together, they spoke at length about the Norse discovery of America. This was a topic at the forefront of Andersen's mind in 1873. He was busy writing his book, America Not Discovered by Columbus, at this time. His book, published in 1874, helped to popularize the idea that the Vikings settled in North America around the year 1000. But first, Andersen was making his case with Ole Bull. Here is what Andersen says about his discussions with Bull in his autobiography entitled Life Story of Rasmus B. Andersen. Quote, I argue that Leif Erikson should be honored with a monument. Christopher Columbus, who was merely the rediscoverer of this continent, had much honor paid to him in the way of monuments, paintings, and otherwise. It was time Leif Erikson should receive similar recognition and honor, end quote. Andersen continued in his book, saying, quote, in this matter, Ole Bull was an easy mark. He had given but little attention to the details of the Norse discovery, but his enthusiasm was easily aroused for anything that would redound to the fame and glory of his dear fatherland, end quote. Bull and Andersen decided that a good location for a statue of Leif Erikson would be on the campus of the University of Wisconsin in Madison, in front of the main building, which is now Bascom Hall, at the top of Bascom Hill. As Andersen explains in his autobiography, quote, there Leif should stand proclaiming his discovery of Vinland, and this would help us to make the University of Wisconsin the chief center of Scandinavian study in the United States. It would help make Madison the Mecca of Norwegiandom in America, end quote. The two men asked John A. Johnson to join their Leif Erikson Monument Committee. Johnson at the time was a state senator and would go on to establish the Gisholt Machine Company in Madison in 1889. Johnson agreed and became treasurer of the committee, with Bull as president and Andersen as secretary. In their efforts to raise funds for the statue project, the committee placed ads in the various Norwegian-American newspapers asking for voluntary contributions, but the effort did not elicit a single response or donation. According to Andersen, Ole Bull felt humiliated and angry. Instead of giving up, Ole Bull asked Andersen to arrange a series of concerts for the benefit of the Leif Erikson Monument Fund. Along with Ole Bull's wife, Sarah, who was Bull's accompanist, the three set out on a tour, playing concerts in Madison, Stoughton, Cambridge, Fort Atkinson, La Crosse, Eau Claire, Prairie du Chien, McGregor, Iowa, and Decorah, Iowa. Every venue was packed, listening to the Bulls perform their music and Andersen speak about the Norse discovery of America. In total, they raised around $2,500, about 10% of what they felt was needed for the statue. The money was turned over to Johnson to hold. Work did not progress on this project, and Ole Bull eventually went back to Norway. In 1876, Bull returned to the United States, but lived in the Boston area. Bull had many high society admirers in New England, where he began to spread the word about the possibility of creating a statue of Leif Erikson. At once, a committee was formed, including the governor of Massachusetts, Alexander Hamilton Rice, the mayors of Boston and Cambridge, and many affluent celebrities and intellectuals, including Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and Edward Everett Hale, the grandnephew of Revolutionary War hero Nathan Hale. The idea of a Leif Erikson statue was an easy sell for Ole Bull because there were many New Englanders who were already captivated with the idea of the Vikings settling in the area and were very quick to buy into the plan to honor the intrepid Viking. One such person was Longfellow. He was an unashamed believer in the discoveries of Leif Erikson. He had been captivated by the news of the unearthing of an ancient warrior in Massachusetts in 1832, who Longfellow was certain was a Viking. The discovery inspired Longfellow in 1841 to write the poem The Skeleton in Armor, a multi-verse composition of a brave Viking. Other works by Longfellow that reveal his admiration of the Old Norse include The Saga of St. Olaf and Tales of a Wayside Inn. Another New England poet, James Russell Lowell, added to the tributes to the Vikings by writing The Voyage to Vinland, which was published in 1868. Besides the unearthing of the ancient warriors celebrated by Longfellow, there were numerous inscriptions found in New England, giving speculation at the time that they were Norse runes. A strong promoter of the theory that the Vikings settled in the area that is now present-day Massachusetts was Eben Norton Horsford, a Harvard chemistry professor. Horsford was the developer of the first double-acting baking powder, which was sold under the name Rumford and which made him a fortune. Horsford was sure, based on his interpretation of the sagas, that Leif Erikson and the Vikings had settled around the Charles River in Massachusetts. He even had a tower built, marking the location of the lost Viking fort and city, Norumbega. Horsford was convinced that the Algonquin word Norumbega was derived from the Latin word Norvega, meaning Norway. Horsford also had a plaque placed near the Norumbega Tower, marking the spot where he believed Leif Erikson built his house in the year 1000. His theories were not backed up by any archaeological or scientific evidence. When Ole Bull came along and started lobbying for a Leif Erikson statue, the New Englanders were ready to act. It did not take long before the needed funds were raised, with the primary donor and fundraiser being Horsford himself. Along with the funds sent by John A. Johnson in Madison, the committee commissioned sculptor Ann Whitney to work on the statue. The statue was unveiled in 1887. It was placed on a Viking ship pedestal on Commonwealth Avenue, overlooking the Boston Back Bay. Horsford delivered the main speech during the ceremonies. The two men responsible for the initial discussion of a Leif Erikson statue 14 years earlier, however, were not in attendance. Ole Bull had died in 1880. Rasmus Andersen was in Denmark at the time, serving in his diplomatic post. Nevertheless, the first statue honoring Leif Erikson was now a reality. Soon afterward, a second statue of the adventurous Viking was put on a pedestal, this time back in Wisconsin. Mrs. Joseph T. Gilbert, a wealthy woman from Wisconsin and a relative of Ole Bull's wife, Sarah, commissioned a smaller version of the Boston statue of Leif Erikson and gave it to the city of Milwaukee, where it was placed in Juneau Park. The next important step in the Leif Erikson movement involved the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. The Exposition, ironically, was a celebration of the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the New World in 1492. Dedication ceremonies for the Exposition took place on October 21, 1892, but the fair did not open to the public until May 1, 1893. As part of the World's Fair celebration, a crew of Norwegians led by Captain Magnus Andersen sailed a Viking ship from Norway to Chicago. The ship, named the Viking, was a reproduction of the famous Gokstad ship. Leaving Bergen, the ship sailed 44 days, reaching New London, Connecticut on June 13, 1893. The Viking arrived at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago on July 12th after sailing through the Great Lakes. During its eastern seaboard and Great Lakes voyage, the ship and crew were honored with multiple rounds of festivities and receptions. An article in the special newspaper, the Leif Erikson Review, published by the Norwegian News Company in 1935, recounted the Vikings' 1893 arrival in Chicago, saying, quote, "Its arrival evoked an outpouring of enthusiasm such as Chicago had never previously experienced. The arrival of the Spanish caravels, unseaworthy replicas of Columbus's 3 ships, which were towed in 5 days earlier, aroused but a mild demonstration of interest by comparison." The article continues, "The Viking, after receptions in Milwaukee and Racine in its triumphal progress toward its destination, was met off Waukegan by a fleet of nearly 200 craft of all descriptions, which came up from Chicago to greet the strange visitors from a distant land across the sea." End quote. At the end of the World's Fair, the Viking was presented to the American people. The ship today is located at Good Templar Park in Geneva, Illinois. The excitement and energy created by the arrival of the Viking in Chicago continued through the final decade of the 19th century, culminating with the statue of Leif Erikson being placed in Chicago's Humboldt Park in 1901. Norwegian-Americans in Chicago had commissioned Sigvald Asbjørnsen to create a statue of the famous explorer. On October 12, 1901, tens of thousands of flag-waving Nordic Americans celebrated the statue's unveiling in heavy rain. Despite the weather, the ceremony continued for 2 hours. The one artifact that provoked the greatest debate and interest of Norse discovery and exploration was the Kensington Runestone, the slab of hard sandstone with runic inscriptions discovered in 1898 by Swedish-American farmer Olaf Ullman near Kensington, Minnesota. Supposedly, the writing on the stone was made by 22 Norwegian and 8 Swedish explorers in the year 1362. Largely regarded as a hoax by notable experts who examined the writing, the stone piqued the public's curiosity about Viking travels. In the early 20th century, the news that the stone was a forgery may have taken the wind out of the sails of the Leif Erikson movement. Perhaps the single event, however, that slowed the Leif Erikson movement was the Americanism ideology in the early 20th century, hitting its peak during World War I. People were encouraged to show their patriotism by dropping the hyphenated American label from their identity, such as Norwegian-American, German-American, Irish-American, and so on. Teddy Roosevelt even went so far as to describe such people as, quote, "those evil enemies of America, the hyphenated Americans." Along with these pressures, Norwegian Americans, like all immigrant groups, were losing some of their ethnic identity through the natural progression of Americanization, such as the gradual loss of the language and customs as newer generations were born into their families and communities. Norwegian Americans were becoming proud and patriotic Americans, but they were not going to forget their past or where they came from completely. This steadfast pride in their culture, heritage, and history helped to create a resurgence in the Leif Erikson movement. The resurgence began in New York City in 1923 when the New York chapter of Associates of the American Scandinavian Foundation endorsed a resolution urging the adoption of a Leif Erikson Day for the entire country. Various chapters throughout the country jumped on the bandwagon and began to promote the idea through their respective programs. The movement was once again in full swing. In an article published in the September 1923 edition of the American Scandinavian Review, H. Sundby Hansen writes, quote, "The movement is now entering upon a new phase of development. Increasing numbers of Americans are asking that justice be done to the memory of this continent's real discoverer by establishing recurring anniversaries. The idea is spreading, and we shall soon have an annual Leif Erikson Day for all Americans." End quote. In May 1925, the Leif Erikson Square was dedicated in Brooklyn, New York, the first time the name of the Norse discoverer was given to a place. The Leif Erikson movement received a big boost in 1925 when the Norse-American Centennial was held in June in Minneapolis. The 4-day celebration was in honor of the 100th anniversary of the arrival of the first immigrant ship from Norway, the Restoration. The Centennial celebration drew nearly 200,000 Norwegian Americans. Not only was the celebration well attended, it also received great recognition from the federal government. In observance of the Norse-American Centennial, the United States Post Office issued a 5-cent stamp with a picture of a Viking ship in commemoration of Leif Erikson's discovery of America, and Congress had a special medal cast in honor of the occasion. The crowning moment, however, came when President Calvin Coolidge gave the principal speech at the Centennial and in his address clearly gave recognition to Leif Erikson's discovery. The Leif Erikson movement was now on the big stage, getting national attention from the highest office in the land. The movement was gaining great notice and moving forward. By 1925, programs, observances, proclamations, and dedications in the name of Leif Erikson were becoming annual events throughout the country. Some of the highlights included the dedication of Leif Erikson Drive in Chicago in the presence of about 20,000 people. The roadway was renamed Lakeshore Drive in 1946. In 1928, a Viking ship christened Leif Erikson was presented to the city of Duluth. The ship, which had sailed from Norway the year before by Captain Gerhard Golgero, was placed in Duluth's Lakeshore Park. The park was renamed Leif Erikson Park at that time, the first park in America to be named after the famous Viking. In 1929, Wisconsin became the first state in the country to pass a law establishing an official Leif Erikson Day. I'll come back to talk about this event in more detail. Minnesota, South Dakota, and Illinois followed Wisconsin's lead and passed similar laws in the 1930s. A congressional resolution signed by President Franklin Roosevelt made October 9th a National Leif Erikson Day in 1935. The resolution, however, was just for the year 1935. It did not proclaim October 9th as a permanent National Leif Erikson Day. These are just a few of the highlights of the growing Leif Erikson movement, but there were hundreds of smaller events throughout the 1920s, 30s, and 40s in Colorado, Indiana, Michigan, Iowa, Washington State, Oregon, California, Massachusetts, and Wisconsin, demonstrating the widespread interest in commemorating the exploits of Leif Erikson. But the one event I want to focus on now is the law passed in Wisconsin in 1929. As I have mentioned, Wisconsin was the first state to enact legislation designating October 9th to be a permanent observance day for Leif Erikson in public schools. The law stated that on October 9th, 1/2 hour may be devoted in the schools to instruction and appropriate exercises relative to and in commemoration of the life and history of Leif Erikson and the principles and ideals he fostered. The question I have is, why Wisconsin? Why was Wisconsin the first state to pass a Leif Erikson Day law? I believe the simple answer is Wisconsin had people who had been focused on such a law for many years. People such as Rasmus B. Anderson, Christian Hoan, Ryder N. Qualley, Professor Julius Olson, and others. In the photo on the screen, we see Governor Walter Kohler signing the bill into law on May 10, 1929, surrounded by supporters of the legislation. Immediately to the right of the governor is Rasmus B. Anderson, the man with the white beard, 56 years after he had mentioned to Ole Bull the need to honor Leif Erikson. Hoan and Qualley are to the left of Anderson, while Olson is the second person on the far right. Many of these people had formed a Leif Erikson Day committee, intent on lobbying the legislature to take up their cause. The chair of the committee was Christian Hoan, who was also the editor of the Wisconsin Tobacco Reporter, the weekly newspaper in Edgerton. It is no surprise, then, that the two legislators who sponsored such a bill were also from Edgerton, Senator George Blanchard and Assemblyman Stanley Slogg. As a newspaperman, Hoan undoubtedly was a persuasive force to convince the legislators from his hometown to sponsor the bill. When the bill was put forth in the Capitol in February 1929, it was passed by unanimous vote of both houses, waiting to be signed by Governor Kohler on May 10th. The Leif Erikson Committee chose October 9th as the day to include in the bill, a date that may have been planted in the committee members' minds back in 1925 during the centennial celebration of Norwegian immigration. The immigrant ship Restoration landed in New York City on October 9th, 1825. It was fitting that October 9th should be the annual date to celebrate Leif Erikson and to honor the beginning of modern Norwegian immigration in 1825. Following the signing of the bill by Governor Kohler, the members of the Leif Erikson Movement in Madison gathered for a banquet to celebrate their accomplishment. Instead of sitting on their laurels, Mr. Hoan kept the movement going by proposing the formation of a national Leif Erikson Memorial Association. Hoan said, quote, "The work that we have started in Wisconsin must be continued and carried through to the other states. The Wisconsin Leif Erikson Day Committee will therefore sponsor the organization of a Leif Erikson Memorial Association on a nationwide basis," end quote. That fall, on September 13th, the Leif Erikson Memorial Association was formed at the home of Rasmus Anderson. Christian Hoan was named the president. Anderson was president emeritus, while Julius Olson was named first vice president. Gina Thompson was second vice president. Ryder N. Quality was treasurer, and Iver M. Kalnes, my grandfather, was named secretary of the organization. Iver Kalnes was present at the bill signing on May 10th. In the photo, he is in the front, two people to the right of Rasmus Anderson. I always thought it was interesting how involved my grandfather became in the Leif Erikson movement in Wisconsin, considering he was somewhat of a newcomer to the state, having moved to Stoughton in 1927 at the age of 42, after spending practically his entire career prior to that in Minnesota. I had wondered why he packed up his family and belongings and moved to Wisconsin. After researching the events of the Leif Erikson movement, I believe I have a theory. I do not have any evidence to back up my theory, but I believe it makes sense. At the time of the 1925 Norse-American Centennial in Minneapolis, my grandfather was working for the newspaper Organized Farmer in Red Wing, Minnesota. It would seem very logical to me that Iver would have attended the centennial celebration as a journalist and as a full-blooded Norwegian, and especially being just down the road in Red Wing. My theory is while he was at the centennial, he possibly met the people from Wisconsin, such as Rasmus Anderson, Christian Hoan, R.N. Qualley, and Professor Julius Olson, who I would assume attended the celebration. Being a journalist and fluent in the Norwegian language, I am sure he made fast friends with Hoan, the editor of the Wisconsin Tobacco Reporter, and an immigrant from Kongsberg, Norway. I can only imagine that the more they talked, the more they made plans for my grandfather to join the Wisconsin Leif Erikson movement by moving to the Badger State. By June of 1927, my grandfather was hired by the Stoughton Courier Hub as the farm editor and columnist. Could it be that Hoan, who was just down the road in Edgerton, helped my grandfather get a job with the Courier Hub? As I said, I don't have any evidence to support that theory, but it makes sense to me. In any regard, I can give you a brief history of my grandfather, who called McFarland his home for the last 25 years of his life. He was born on July 31st, 1884, on the family farm in Pope County, Minnesota, near the town of Starbuck. His parents were Peter Kalnes, who had immigrated from Numedalside, Norway in 1880, and Christina Ottesen, who was born in a log cabin in Vermont Township in western Dane County. Her parents had immigrated from Luster, Norway in the Sogna region. Iver's parents sent him to Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, where he graduated in 1907. Soon after graduation, Iver returned to Minnesota and purchased his hometown newspaper, the Starbuck Times, beginning his 40-year newspaper career. He married Anna Vangsnes on December 6, 1919. She had immigrated in 1909 from Vangsnes, Norway, located on the Sogna Fjord. They had 5 children, 3 who were born in Minnesota and 2 after they moved to Wisconsin. My mom, Pauline, born in 1925, is standing in the center of the photo. Behind her are her older siblings, Ruth and Irving. In the front are the younger siblings, Marianne and Ras. 4 of the 5 attended Luther College. Unfortunately, Irving died while at Luther during his sophomore year. My mom, Ruth, and Ras all graduated from Luther and married spouses who also attended Luther. Marianne went to the University of Wisconsin. She married Major League Baseball pitcher Robin Roberts in 1949 at the McFarland Lutheran Church. Ras was born in 1931. It is interesting to note that his godfather was Rasmus B. Anderson. My uncle's full name is Rasmus Bjorn Anderson Kalnes. As I said, after college, Iver immediately began his newspaper career by purchasing his hometown newspaper, the Starbuck Times. He continued his involvement with the Times until 1914, followed by short stints with a variety of weekly newspapers. During the years of 1914 and 1915, Iver also attended law school. In 1922, he moved his family to Chicago, where he earned a journalism degree from Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. While there, he also worked as a crime reporter for the Chicago Tribune. He returned to Minnesota and worked briefly at the Bemidji Independent before spending a couple of years at the Organized Farmer and Red Wing. It is at Red Wing when he made the decision to move to Stoughton to become the Courier Hub's farm editor and columnist in 1927, a position he held for only 1 year. In May 1928, William T. Evu, the publisher of the Capital Times, came calling, luring Iver away from the Courier Hub and Stoughton. At the Cap Times, Iver worked as the farm editor and had a column titled Kalnes Says. Besides his short stint with the Chicago Tribune in 1923, this was Iver's first job with a daily newspaper. Iver moved his family from Stoughton to live on Jennifer Street in Madison, just 1 block down from his friend R.N. Qualley. In 1933, Iver left the Capital Times to join Evu's arch rival, the Wisconsin State Journal. In an article announcing his hiring, the State Journal said, quote, "He is a student and evangel of Scandinavian culture. He is thoroughly informed in all farm matters, but Mr. Collins's cultural perspective reaches far beyond the civilization of any particular nationality. He is a student and a critic of American civilization, with intelligence and learning that covers a wide field." End quote. Despite the grand introduction, Iver's stay at the State Journal was brief, leaving in 1935 to help start up a new newspaper, the Lutherland News, a weekly publication based in Madison that was focused on news from the Lutheran churches in south-central Wisconsin. Unfortunately, the mid-1930s was a bad time to start a new publication. After much promise, the Lutherland News went out of business in 1936. By 1938, Iver was back with Evu at the Capital Times, working as a reporter and columnist until his poor health forced his retirement in 1948. During his career as a reporter and columnist, Iver would cover numerous events relating to the Norwegian community. He was often the guest speaker at 17. Mai, Sons of Norway, or Bygdelag programs during the 1930s and 1940s. He would also cover the annual Norwegian Lutheran Church Synod conventions, often being a delegate from the McFarland Lutheran Church. In 1939, he was part of the press entourage that followed Norway's Crown Prince Olaf and Princess Martha on a 2-day, 6-stop tour of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa. It is curious to see the amusing headline on the front page article from the Cap Times on May 8, 1939. Kalnes finds Norwegian royal couple democratic and likable, juxtaposed below the headline about Hitler, considering how in less than a year the Nazis would be invading Norway and starting the 5-year occupation. During the war, Iver worked tirelessly to promote the cause of the American Relief for Norway and the Norwegian Relief, Inc. campaigns, often hosting dignitaries from the U.S. and Norway who traveled the country seeking support. Iver's efforts were recognized by King Haakon VII, sending a certificate that read, "Norway thanks you for your valuable efforts during the struggle for the country's liberation." Iver was a member of numerous Norwegian-American organizations and quite often served as an officer. He would make sure that any event, program, or announcement would appear in the newspaper. Besides his involvement in Norwegian-related events and being a reporter, Iver always had a desire to be in public office. Politics was a very important part of his character, but one area that he never saw success. He ran for numerous political offices over the years in Minnesota and Wisconsin, but never won an election, even losing the local election for the McFarland Board of Trustees, the community he and his family moved to in 1934. He ran on the Liberal side in most of his races, except for his early political days in Minnesota when he ran on the Prohibition ticket. Over the years, he moved to the Farmer Labor Party and then the Progressive Party. In announcing his candidacy for the Wisconsin Assembly in 1938, Iver said, quote, "I have been a progressive all my life. In 1924, I actively campaigned for Robert M. La Follette for president, both in my little country weekly and on the stump," end quote. Political victories may have evaded Iver, but he always had his Norwegian-American groups for support and consolation. The most important aspect to Iver's life by far was his involvement in the Norwegian-American culture and organizations. He was especially devoted to the Leif Erikson Movement, serving as secretary of the Leif Erikson Day Committee and the Leif Erikson Memorial Association from the very beginning. He was named president of the group in 1952, serving until his death in 1959. His steadfast involvement in the movement, his reporting on the Norwegian-American culture and organizations, and his devotion to his ancestral homeland led to his great honor of being presented the St. Olaf Medal on behalf of King Haakon VII. The ceremony took place in Milwaukee on October 9, 1951, 70 years ago. In the photo, Iver is receiving the St. Olaf Medal from George Skogmo, the Norwegian Vice Consul for Wisconsin. Looking on are my grandmother, Anna, to the left of Iver. Sitting to the left is my mother, Pauline, holding my sister, Marianne, while my dad, Kurt, is standing to the right, behind my brother, Kurt. Over 200 friends, colleagues, and officials were in attendance, representing the Sons of Norway, the Leif Erikson Memorial Association, the National Sagnalag, the Scandinavian American Fraternity, and the Yggdrasil Literary Society. Speakers included Christian Hoan, R.N. Qualley, and William T. Evu, all former recipients of King Olaf citations. The Capital Times article covering the ceremony stated that Iver, in a warm, informal manner, said the honor came to one who has never seen Norway, expressing special appreciation to Hoan for the recognition. He also spoke of his family, his children and grandchildren, and of his happy, rewarding association with the men and women in the Norwegian-American organizations. Iver continued his involvement in the Leif Erikson movement during the 1950s with renewed vigor and determination in pursuing his goal of making October 9th a national observance day for Leif Erikson. He was the last original board member of the Leif Erikson Memorial Association after the deaths of Hoan and Qualley in 1952, so I can imagine that he was feeling a sense of urgency to complete the task. Now retired from his newspaper career and the new president of the Leif Erikson Memorial Association, Iver was relentless in his lobbying efforts to reach the goal, resulting in a letter-writing campaign to senators and congressmen. In January and early February of 1959, Iver received letters from Congressman Henry Royce and Senator William Proxmire, thanking him for promoting the idea of a National Observance Day for Leif Erikson. They also enclosed copies of resolutions they had introduced for the Leif Erikson Day. The congressional record shown here includes Proxmire's joint resolution requesting that the President proclaim October 9th of each year to be Leif Erikson Day. It goes on to say that, quote, "A presidential proclamation would be an entirely appropriate means of recognizing the importance of the discoveries of Leif Erikson and the other Norsemen who followed him to the North American continent. It would be a dramatic and effective means of reminding all Americans of the heritage we have received from these early explorers and from the generations of Nordic peoples who followed them to these shores in the centuries that have followed," end quote. The resolution was referred to the Committee on the Judiciary, but it did not go any further. Iver died 2 months later in March 1959. Several years later, in 1963, Senator Hubert Humphrey and Representative John Blatnick, both from Minnesota, introduced bills to observe Leif Erikson Day nationwide. On September 2, 1964, Congress unanimously authorized the bill and requested the President to create the observance through an annual proclamation. That fall, Lyndon Johnson became the first president to make such a proclamation since FDR in 1935. Since 1964, every president has issued a proclamation observing October 9th as Leif Erikson Day and praising the contributions of all Americans of Nordic descent. I'm not sure what happened to the Leif Erikson Memorial Association after my grandfather died. I do not have any records of the organization after 1959. The Luther College Archives has the Leif Erikson Memorial Association of America papers from 1929 to 1951. I am thinking that the association died the same day Iver Kalnes died. I had just turned 5 years old when Iver died, so my recollections of him are very few. But I did follow him in the newspaper business, beginning in 1978, when I was hired as the librarian for the Wisconsin State Journal. In 1988, the State Journal Library merged with the Capital Times Library, allowing me to become the library director for the merged library, serving the two newspapers where my grandfather worked. It was always fun to run across his articles or columns while searching through the archives. For a number of years, I pored through the microfilm of the State Journal looking for columns written by my grandfather. In 1996, I compiled many of those columns and published them into a book titled Little Visits with a Journal Reporter, which was the name of his newspaper column. He would interview people around Dane County, farmers, ministers, business people, and write about their lives. He often interviewed old-timers and wrote about their experiences in the county back in the mid to late 19th century. The columns chosen for the book were those that best portrayed an historical perspective of the people, communities, and organizations throughout Dane County. The book is available through the online public library catalog, LinkCat. Tusen Takk. Thank you so much for listening, and happy Leif Erikson Day.